Mr. Morrison, this council has already made its decision, the chairman declared, his voice cold and final, but in that hushed room, a frail old man stood his ground, Frank Morrison, a veteran who had given everything and asked for nothing. As the council's gavel hovered, the heavy doors swung open, and a uniformed general strode in, his medals gleaming under the flickering lights. He carried a truth that would shake the room to its core. Will this hero stand save his home? Stay with us, welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The town of Willow Creek woke slowly to the gray light of an overcast morning, its narrow streets still damp from the night's rain, a place where everyone knew everyone, and change was something that came on tiptoes, if it came at all. But today, change stood at the door, loud and insistent. At the end of Willow Street, the Morrison house had stood for over 50 years, weathered wood and peeling paint, a wraparound porch that leaned just slightly as if it were tired of holding up the memories within. Frank Morrison lived there, a man whose silence told stories no one else dared to ask. He was a veteran of Vietnam. Some said he'd fought in battles so fierce that he never spoke of them, only carried them in the quiet way he moved, in the small rituals that shaped his days. Every morning he raised the faded flag in his yard. Every evening he sat on that same porch, staring at the horizon like he was waiting for someone who would never return. Now the city wanted his home. The council had plans to tear it down and raise something shiny in its place, a sprawling shopping center that promised jobs and money. The council chamber buzzed with anticipation as the public hearing began. Men in suits, women in crisp blouses, all shuffling papers and checking phones, ready to discuss the fate of a building that was more than just wood and nails. Frank sat in the front row, his shoulders squared in an old brown jacket that had seen as many winters as he had. His face was a map of time, deep lines etched by sun and memory. He clutched a worn folder to his chest as if it held not just papers, but the very essence of his life. Behind him, Emily Carter watched in silence. She was young, barely 30, with hair pulled back in a loose braid and eyes that missed nothing. She had always kept to the edges, never wanting to draw attention, but today, she was here for a reason she hadn't yet shared. Emily knew more about Frank than most. She knew that every board in that house had been nailed down by his own hands, that every corner held echoes of laughter and loss. She had seen how he polished the brass doorknob every Sunday, a habit that spoke of pride, or perhaps of a promise he hadn't been able to let go. The meeting was called to order by Councilman Briggs, a man who wore his confidence like a tailored suit. He spoke of progress, of the economic boost the new development would bring. His voice was smooth, practiced, but when he spoke of the Morrison property, there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Like he knew this wouldn't be easy. Frank's name was called, and he stood slowly, the creak of old bones blending with the hush that fell over the room. He walked to the podium with the steady grace of someone who had faced worse than this. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the folder down and looked out at the council, at the crowd that had gathered to witness this moment. For a heartbeat, he said nothing, just stood there, breathing in the air of a room that felt colder than it should have. Then he spoke, his voice low and worn, but firm. This house, he said, his gaze sweeping the room, is not just a place. It is the last link I have to the men I served with, to the brothers I lost. The room grew still, the shuffle of papers fading into silence. Frank's eyes were clear, though the years had dimmed their light. He told them of the nights he sat by the window, listening to the wind and remembering the voices of men who never made it home, of how the floorboards still creaked in the exact rhythm of footsteps he once heard in the jungle. He spoke of promises made on distant battlefields, promises to remember and to honor. They didn't get to come home, he said, voice catching for a moment, but I did. And this house is where I keep them alive. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had heard pieces of this story before, but never like this, never with the raw honesty that cracked through the quiet of the council chamber. At the back of the room, a man in a crisp suit shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, but Councilman Briggs cleared his throat, the politician's mask slipping for just a second. Mr. Morrison, he said carefully, we understand your feelings, but progress. Frank raised a hand, stopping him with a gesture that was almost gentle. I know about progress, he said. I fought for it once, but some things aren't meant to be torn down. He paused, breathing deeply, his hand resting on the folder as if drawing strength from it. I don't expect you to understand what this house means, but I'm asking you to see me, to see the men who never got to come home, because if you tear this down, you're not just taking a house, you're taking every memory that's ever lived here. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Emily leaned forward, her fingers clutching the edge of her seat. She could feel the weight of his words pressing into the room, could see the way some of the council members shifted, unsure of what to say. Frank took another breath, shoulders sagging just a little, but his eyes never wavered. I've given everything I had to this country, he said softly. This is all I have left. Let me keep it. He stepped back from the podium then, his legs unsteady, but his gaze still steady as a mountain. The folder in his hand trembled, the only sign of the effort it had taken to stand there and lay his heart bare. Emily watched him return to his seat, her own heart pounding. She knew that today wasn't just about A house, it was about what that house stood for, about the quiet dignity of a man who had already given too much. The council chamber was silent, the kind of silence that holds its breath outside, in the clouds pressed low against the sky, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Could a young woman's courage turn the tide? The hush that had settled over the council chamber lingered like a held breath. Frank remained in his seat, his shoulders curved inward, but his gaze fixed forward. For a moment, he seemed smaller, as if the years had finally caught up to him. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the worn folder in his lap. His fingers traced the frayed edges, the papers inside yellowed with age. When he spoke, his voice was softer, almost a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. This house, he said, is more than timber and nails. It's a monument to the men I served with, to the ones who never came home and the ones who came back, but never really left that battlefield behind. His words drew the eyes of every person in that room. Some leaned forward, others sat back, arms crossed, masks of impatience or calculation on their faces. But Frank didn't see them. His eyes looked somewhere else, backward into a memory he had never fully left behind. He spoke of nights spent in the darkness of a jungle, the rain falling like bullets on the leaves, of whispers and promises made in foxholes, men swearing to watch each other's backs until the end. We fought for each other, he said, and we promised we'd keep the memories alive, even if the world moved on. As he spoke, his voice grew steadier, like the act of sharing was pulling strength from some place deep inside. He paused for a breath, and in that pause, he let his mind slip back to a single moment that had come to define him. He was 23, halfway around the world in a country he didn't understand. The night was black, the air hot and thick. He and his unit had been pinned down by mortar fire, the enemy close and relentless. In the chaos, he heard the desperate cry of a man, an officer, a kid really trapped under a collapsed trench wall. Frank didn't think, he just moved. His hands dug into the dirt, pulling and clawing until the young man's face appeared, blood and sweat streaking down his skin. Frank grabbed his shoulders, ignoring the hot pain in his own back, and heaved until the young officer was free. The world roared around them, but in that moment, there was only the two of them and the unspoken promise that neither would be left behind. I carried him out of that jungle, Frank said softly, his eyes locked on the past, and I swore I'd carry the memory of every man who never made it out with us. He blinked, the memory fading, but never truly gone. The council chamber came back into focus, the weight of what he'd shared pressing on every person who had listened. Some faces were thoughtful, touched by the gravity of his words. Others looked down at their papers, frowning, calculating. Emily watched them all, her hands clenched in her lap. She saw the lines on Frank's face, the way his shoulders slumped just a little, as if he had spent the last of his strength to make them see. Councilman Briggs cleared his throat. Mr. Morrison, he said, his voice carefully neutral, we appreciate your service, but we have to weigh the needs of the community. This development, it will bring jobs, revenue. Frank didn't argue, he simply sat back, the folder still clutched to his chest, his eyes steady. The message was clear, he had said all he needed to say, now it was up to them. Emily's heart ached as she watched him. She had known Frank for years, in small ways, a nod on the street, a shared moment of silence at the war memorial every Veterans Day, but she had never heard him speak like this. She had never seen him lay his soul bare. She looked down at her own hands, trembling slightly. In her purse, she carried something she had never shown anyone, a small folded flag. Edges frayed, colors faded by time and touch. It had belonged to her father and before him to the man who had saved his life. Emily stood, the chair scraped softly against the floor as she rose, the quiet sound louder than any shout in the heavy air of that room. Heads turned, surprise flickering in their eyes. She took a breath, her voice calm but unwavering. I need to speak, she said. Her words weren't a question, they were a statement. Councilman Briggs looked at her, brow raised. Miss Emily Carter, she said. My father was Captain Thomas Carter. He served in Vietnam, and he only made it home because of Frank Morrison. A ripple moved through the room. Frank turned to look at her, his eyes widening just slightly. Emily stepped forward, her hand slipping into her purse to pull out the folded flag. She held it up, the old cloth trembling slightly in her grasp. This flag was given to my father when he came home, she said, but he said it belonged to Frank, because Frank was the reason he lived to see his children, to build a life. Her voice wavered, but she kept going. Frank never talked about what he did, he never asked for thanks, but today, I want everyone to know he didn't just save my father's life, he gave me the chance to be here, to stand here and say this house, it's not just his, it's a promise, a debt we all owed. Silence fell again, but this time, it was different, heavier, more real. Emily saw the shift in the faces around her. She saw the way some of them looked down, suddenly unable to meet her eyes. Frank's mouth opened slightly, his eyes shimmering with something he hadn't let anyone see in years, gratitude and a hint of relief. Emily let her gaze travel the room, her fingers tightening on the flag. If you tear down that house, she said quietly, you're not just tearing down walls, you're tearing down the last testament to men who gave everything, men like Frank who still carry those battles inside them. She lowered the flag slowly, her arms trembling with the weight of what she'd said. Frank reached out, his hand resting on the worn wood of the bench between them. Their eyes met, a silent thank you passing between them, wordless and absolute. The room was still. For the first time that morning, no one seemed to know what to say. Outside, the sky lightened just a little, a hint of sun breaking through the clouds, and in that fragile light, the fate of an old house, and the memory of those who had fought for it, hung in the balance. Will a general's arrival change everything? The hush that had settled over the room was broken by the soft creak of the chamber doors. Heads turned as a figure stepped inside, the sound of polished boots striking the tile floor, echoing in the sudden quiet. He wore a dark uniform, the silver eagles of a general glinting under the fluorescent lights. General Henry Walker paused at the threshold, his eyes scanning the room. His posture was straight, his shoulders broad, and there was a gravity about him that drew every gaze. But when his eyes found Frank, sitting small and weary near the front, they softened. He walked forward with measured steps, each one deliberate. Emily stood aside, her heart pounding, the flag still clutched in her hands. She had known he would come, but seeing him there in that moment, it was something she could never have imagined. General Walker reached the front of the chamber and turned to face the council. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of command. "My name is General Henry Walker," he said simply, "and before you make your decision today, you need to hear what this man means to me." He paused, letting the words settle. "Over 50 years ago, I was a young lieutenant in Vietnam. My unit was caught in an ambush. The world was fire and noise, and I was pinned under the weight of my own fear." His eyes drifted to Frank, his gaze steady. "Frank Morrison didn't hesitate. He pulled me out of that hell with his bare hands. He saved my life." A murmur swept through the room, some leaning in as if to catch every word. Emily watched, her fingers pressed against the flag, her breath shallow. The general's voice never wavered. "I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for him," he said. "Everything I have done since, every life I have touched, every soldier I have led, it is because Frank Morrison had the courage to stand up when it mattered most." He turned then, facing the council fully. His eyes were clear, and the authority in his voice left no room for doubt. "I understand progress," he said. "I have seen how change can lift communities. But there is a difference between progress and erasure, and tearing down that house would be an erasure." The silence that followed was different from before. It was a silence of understanding, of reckoning. Emily saw it in the way some of the council members shifted, their eyes no longer avoiding hers or Frank's. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of them. General Walker took a breath, his gaze flicking briefly to Frank before returning to the council. "If you go through with this, you're not just removing a building, you're erasing the legacy of a man who gave everything for his brothers and for this country." Frank sat with his hands resting in his lap, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes, a small flicker of the fire that had carried him through so much. Emily felt tears sting at the corners of her eyes. She had known the story, but hearing it spoken aloud by the man whose life had been saved, hearing the weight of those words made it real in a way that nothing else could. The general stepped closer to Frank, his voice softening. "I owe my life to Frank Morrison," he said, "and I won't stand by while the last piece of his history is wiped away. This house is a monument to everything he has done. It is a promise that men like him will never be forgotten." He turned to the council one last time. "I'm asking you, no, I'm urging you to let this house stand. Let it remind us all of the quiet heroism that built this nation. Let it be the legacy it was always meant to be." Frank's eyes glistened and Emily could see his lips curve into a small, tired smile. He reached out, his fingers brushing the sleeve of the general's uniform, a silent thank you that spoke more than any words. General Walker rested a hand on Frank's shoulder, his expression soft and full of respect. The room was still, but there was a different energy in the air now, the kind of electricity that comes when the truth is finally spoken, and everyone knows it can't be ignored. Councilman Briggs cleared his throat, but the usual confidence in his voice was gone. "General Walker," he said quietly, we hear you. We'll review the plans again." Frank nodded, his shoulders sagging in relief. Emily felt her own shoulders loosen, the tension that had gripped her chest slowly easing, but she saw the way Frank's hands trembled now, the way his breathing had grown shallow. He had given everything he had in that room today, just as he had given everything so many years ago. He leaned back against the chair, his face pale, but his eyes still clear. Emily moved to his side and slipping her hand into his. "You did it, Frank," she whispered. "You made them see." He gave her a faint smile, the lines in his face softening. "It was never about me," he murmured. "It was about them, the ones we left behind." His voice was quiet, almost lost in the hush of the room. Then his eyes fluttered closed and his shoulders slumped forward. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Frank," she said, her voice shaking, but he didn't respond. His head tilted to the side, and the strength that had carried him through so much seemed to slip away all at once. General Walker's face went pale. "Call an ambulance," he said sharply. His voice was calm, but his eyes were dark with worry. One of the council members fumbled for a phone, his hands shaking. Emily held Frank's hand tightly, her fingers trembling. "Hold on, Frank," she whispered, "please, just hold on." She could feel the faint beat of his pulse, each one weaker than the last. The paramedics burst through the doors moments later, their voices calm and professional as they worked quickly. Emily stepped back, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears sliding down her cheeks. General Walker stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent pillar of strength. As they lifted Frank onto the stretcher, Emily reached out, laying the folded flag gently on his chest. "He never stopped fighting," she said softly. "He never stopped remembering." General Walker's voice was low but steady. "And neither will we," he said, "neither will we." The paramedics wheeled Frank out of the room, their footsteps echoing in the hush. The council chamber was still, every eye fixed on the empty space he had left behind. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds at last, light streaming through the high windows to fall in warm golden shafts on the worn wood floor. It felt like a benediction, a promise that what Frank had stood for would never truly fade. The first thing Frank noticed when he woke was the smell of antiseptic and the steady beeping of a heart monitor. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, bright and warm, a soft contrast to the cool air of the hospital room. He blinked slowly, the world coming back into focus. Emily sat by his bed, her hair falling over her shoulder in a soft wave. Her eyes were red, but they were smiling. "Hey there," she said, her voice gentle. "You're back." Frank tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Emily pressed a straw to his lips and he took a sip of water, feeling the cool relief spread through him. "The house," he managed, his voice a rasp. "It's safe," she said softly. "The council has called off the project. They've agreed to declare it a historical site, a place to remember." Frank closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of it settling into his chest like a quiet blessing. When he opened them again, General Walker stood at the foot of the bed, his uniform immaculate, his eyes steady and kind. "You gave them no choice," Walker said with a small smile. "They saw the truth because you showed it to them, and I'll be here to make sure they never forget." Frank nodded weakly, his hand curling around the edge of the blanket. There was relief in his expression, but something else too, a softness, a gratitude that needed no words. He had carried the burden for so long, and now he didn't have to carry it alone. Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "They're turning the house into a memorial," she said, "a place for people to learn about what you and your brothers gave, a place for stories that matter." Frank's lips curved into a small smile, faint, but real good. He murmured, "That's good." The days passed slowly, each one a little easier than the last. Frank grew stronger, his voice returning, his laughter soft but sure. Emily visited every day, bringing flowers from her garden and the old flag that had meant so much to them both. One afternoon, she placed it on the windowsill, the faded colors catching the light of the setting sun. Frank watched it flutter gently in the breeze, a symbol of all he had fought for and all that would live on. General Walker came often, too, always in uniform, always with a quiet dignity that filled the small room. He would sit by Frank's bed and talk about the old days, about the men they had known, the battles they had survived, but he never let Frank forget that those days had not been in vain. "You carried them with you all these years," Walker said one evening, his hand resting on Frank's shoulder. "Now let this house carry them forward. Let it remind every soul who walks through its doors that freedom is never free." Frank nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I will," he said softly, "I promise." When Frank was well enough to leave the hospital, the whole town seemed to turn out to greet him. Neighbors he hadn't seen in years stopped him on the sidewalk, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service. Children pointed at him shyly, their parents whispering stories they'd only just learned. Emily walked beside him, her smile warm and steady, and General Walker followed just behind, his presence a quiet shield of honor. They went straight to the house on Willow Street. The old boards had been scrubbed clean, the porch repaired, a fresh coat of paint gleamed in the soft afternoon light, but the soul of the place, its history remained untouched. The council had posted a small plaque beside the door. "Morrison House, a place of remembrance, a testament to sacrifice and silent strength." Frank stepped onto the porch, his cane tapping softly on the newly mended boards. He paused at the threshold, breathing in the scent of old wood and fresh air. Emily slipped the flag into his hands and he held it close to his chest. "It's yours again," she said quietly, "and it always will be." Inside, the house had been turned into a small museum. Photographs lined the walls, old letters in glass cases, a single uniform jacket hanging with quiet pride, but at the center of it all was a simple chair, worn and sturdy, set by the window where Frank had spent so many evenings watching the world go by. Frank lowered himself into that chair, his hands resting on the arms, his eyes closing for a moment. He could hear the echoes of the past in the creak of the floor, the whisper of the wind, but this time they felt like comfort, not ghosts. Emily stood beside him, her hand on the back of the chair, and General Walker placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," the general said softly. "None of us are." Frank looked up at him, his eyes clear and calm. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." The general nodded, his lips curving into a small smile. "You've done enough, Frank, let the rest of us carry it from here." As the sun dipped low over Willow Creek, the old house stood quiet and proud, a beacon of memory in a world that so often tried to forget. And in that quiet, Frank found something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Emily pressed the folded flag to the window, its colors bright against the glass. "This is how we remember," she said softly, "by carrying it forward, one story at a time. Frank closed his eyes, the light warm on his face. He knew that someday he would be just a name on a plaque, a memory in the minds of strangers, but for now, he was here, he was seen, and that was enough. The house on Willow Street became more than just a building in the years that followed. It became a place where people came to learn, to remember, to honor, a place where children pressed their hands to old photographs and felt the weight of history in the quiet rooms, and through it all, the spirit of Frank Morrison, of every man who had given more than he'd ever been asked, lived on, in the creak of the porch floor, in the whisper of the flag by the window, in the soft hush of voices telling stories that mattered. This was the legacy of a quiet hero, this was the promise of a home that would never again be just walls and boards, but a testament to the quiet strength of a man who had already given everything, and in that promise, there was hope, soft and certain, like the dawn after a long night. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.